All right, you're going to be, these notes that kind of go with your PowerPoint, they're kind of filling some of the areas we're not going to in class. So write some of this stuff down. I will be having instructions as we go along as well. So for this assignment, you want to get out before we do anything more, get out a piece of paper, scratch paper, put it next to you, and then I'll kind of tell you instructions as we go. Go ahead and make sure to put your name on the top of that right now.
All right, so for this, we're going to start with a hypothesis. Once you get some observations and you have some questions that you need to know, we're going to make some inferences or interpretations based on that knowledge, and it's going to lead us to an hypothesis. And a definition there you can see is a scientific explanation for a set of observations, and the key is the testability of it, and it will either reject or support. Do not make a hypothesis based on the idea of you wanting to support what you want to see. It should be your own. You shouldn't necessarily know the results. The hypothesis is what it is, okay? And once again, it's based on our limited evidence from a starting point, and the purpose of a hypothesis is to allow us further explanation of our question. We'll have an experiment, and one of the best ways I like to do hypothesis, and I've said this in class, is to use if-then statements, and those if-then statements are allow us some opportunity to. So a good example of this that I can think of is you think about the fall. And the leaves are changing color, and you're trying to figure out what's causing that change. So you observe them. You notice it always happens around the same time. Happens more maybe in Nebraska than it does down in Texas. And so you come up with an idea that it has something to do with temperature. And so when you create an if-then statement based on that, it's going to allow you to kind of set that up. So if you said something like, if the leaf change in color is related to temperature, then exposing plants to low temperatures will result in changes of the leaf. Okay, so it's an if-then statement where if the color change, that's what's going to happen. It's going to be caused by temperature. Then if the color change, then the experiment. This part of it here is the experiment. That's what we expect to happen based on that experiment. Okay, and so what I want you to do now on that piece of paper you to come up with, I'm going to give you an example of a situation, and I want you to come up with and write down on there, number one, write down a hypothesis for this particular example. Okay, so the scenario is that you have been paid to figure out the relationship between temperature and radish germination. Now, before we do hypothesis, it may be important that you look up the word germination. In this case, germination is the actual when the seed, after fertilization, so a fertilized seed, actually begins to sprout. So the question is, what effect does high temperature have on a radish germination? I want you to come up with an hypothesis for that question. What effect does high temperature have on radish germination? So go ahead and on your piece of paper, write that down right now, and you can pause the video and do that now. So question one is going to be based on radish germination. Okay, so now what's important here is if you did a proper if-then statement, then there should be, notice I did there should be an experiment built into the then portion. So for me, I said if temperature is increased in 5-degree increments, then radish germination will increase. Okay, so those two things, the if there is a variable, right? The temperature is the variable. The if temperature, that's a variable. The radish germination is another variable. It's going to change based on that first one, okay? And so when we have a hypothesis, it says in the second line right here, hypothesis should be tested by an experiment. I have an idea based on that statement how I could test it. We call that a controlled experiment. What I want you to do now is for question 2, I want you to answer this question. What is the effect that listening to music while studying has on as a student studies for a test? So in other words, you have a biology test coming up. What is the effect that studying with music has on biology test scores. I want you to come up with a hypothesis on how you could come up with something for that. So I'll say it one last time, and then then you should pause it and answer the question for question 2 on the sheet you'll turn in. What effect does studying with music have on a student's test score? What I said for that one is that if students use music, then their test score will increase versus students who did not listen to music. I see an experiment already set up with that design. It's important to look at the variables in each one of these examples that I give you. So there are 2 types of things we want to look at. The first thing is called the independent variable, okay? The independent variable, also called the manipulative variable, the thing that we are going to manipulate. So think back to the last example about music. What do we have control over? In other words, what are we going to have some students have and some not? The correct answer is the music. So the music is an example of the independent variable. It's what we can change. Some groups will have it, some don't. Okay? Now what happens is the dependent variable in this case is what's going to, also known as responding variable, will be affected by that. So in our example, test scores are the dependent variable. Independent is what we're going to change between 2 different groups. The dependent is what's going to change based off of the independent variable. Going back to that first example with the radishes, what is, and I want you to answer this for question 3 on your sheet that you're going to bring to class. Question 3, what is the independent variable when we talked about temperature and radish germination? Remember, I'll repeat the hypothesis: if temperature is increased, then radish germination will increase. What is the independent variable? In other words, what is going to be the thing that we can control or change? The second part for number 3 that I want you to write is what is the dependent variable? The dependent variable is the thing that's going to change based on independent. Okay, so go ahead and do that now. Pause if you need more time. A couple things that all hypotheses should be, if you really want to have a good hypothesis, it should be simple, it should be clear to understand, it should be written as a statement. Okay, you're not Ron Burgundy, don't ask questions. Will it do this? No, it's a statement. You should establish a couple things. You should establish for the reader, 1, who is participating in this, or what species, what organism. 2, what variables are going to be used, and a prediction of results. How will you know what will happen? They will grow taller, things like that. Remember, when you talk about the variables, then you should also have the independent and the dependent variable. Okay? The last thing that I would put, number 4, and this one's the most important, it must be testable. Can't emphasize that enough. When we do experiments, we like to have 2 groups. One is called a controlled group, and the other one's the experimental. The control group, as it says here, is going to have the exact same conditions as the experimental group, except for 1 variable change. So if I was going to test radish growth with temperature, everything else should be the same. So think about all the things that you should keep the same, and then change only one. So I would want to keep the temperature, or excuse me, the amount of water that it gets, the seed, how old the seed is, the soil type, the chemicals in the soil, any fertilizer that I use, when do I measure the growth? All those types of things should remain the same for both groups. The only thing I change for the independent variable would be the temperature. Okay? We want to reduce the possible reasons why something may not turn the way it does. So if I did this experiment and I got radishes to grow more using a higher temperature, I want to make sure people who read my research say the only possible reason those radishes grew more was due to the temperature increase. What I want you to do is think back to that example about studying in music, okay? So we talked about how increased music or listening to music while studying helps increase your grade, and you had an if-then statement. For the next question on the sheet that you'll turn into class, I want you to write now all of the variables that you would need to control. So what variables do you need to control between the two groups, the control and the experimental? And just start listing different things that you would want both groups would both have to have. Okay, I'll give you an example. They probably should be in the same class. I know that seems simple. You should come up with a lot of them, but it wouldn't be fair to have my honors biology class listen to music and then Mr. Geringer's honors biology class not listen to music and compare the results. So think of all the variables that you'd want to keep the same between the two groups that are taking the test. Come up with as many and write them down. You should have a lot more than 5. Okay, so that gets us to, we'll record the experimental, gather information, and then you come up with this last part. And this is what one of the last questions I want you to do on this sheet. I want you to come up with an experiment. Basically, here's the deal. I came up with this new fish product for fish food that guarantees to increase the growth of your fish. So in other words, your goldfish will be bigger if you have a pond in your backyard than using just a standard fish food. So once again, I want you to do this. Come up with a hypothesis for this. My claim is that this stuff will work better than this stuff. Come up with a hypothesis. 2, in that hypothesis, I want to label the independent and dependent variable. 3, what I want you to do is list as many controlling factors, things that you have to control in the experiment. What variables do you have to control? Maybe I'll give you one example. The type of fish you use should be the same. Okay, so I want you to come up with those 3 things for a comparison between fish food, which is supposedly going to work better than goldfish fish food. Go ahead and pause it, write that down now. Okay, so you should have unpaused it. Last few things to note, we should go kind of quickly. Where is the source of errors? We know this. I don't know why everyone always thinks it's great to write human error as the #1 source of error when you're doing a project. It usually is. Okay, and so that's one potential source of error. It also might be, it's hard to measure or determine exactly what we want to measure. We'll do a lab in here where we can't measure what we want, so we are going to indirectly measure something. We're going to measure, we can't measure how much sugar is being used by your body, but we can measure how much carbon dioxide is given off that's a byproduct of using that sugar, okay? So the other thing that's really important here is the sample size. We want a large sample size. If I had that 5 fish food and I used 3 fish on one side and 3 on the other, that's not a large sample. Randomness could account for this fish food being better. So large sample size. The more, the better. If we could have 1,000 kids in class collect data versus just 2, it's going to be better results. After we get that data, we're going to draw a conclusion. We're going to take it, and it has to be based on our actual data that we got, to either do one of 3 things with that original hypothesis. We can say that our data supported the hypothesis, and at that point, we are done. We can say that it refuted the hypothesis. In other words, the hypothesis was wrong. Our next step in the scientific process, come up with a new hypothesis, and then you guessed it, we're going to go back through the experiment, do experiment, data, and all that. The last one is to revise. Maybe some of the hypothesis was correct, we didn't word it right, or we didn't allow for most of the variables to be taken care of. We'll revise it. Once again, once you revise, got to go back into the experimental process. And then once you do that, your new hypothesis, you either support it, refute it, or revise it. And so this is the example of how it works. At any point in this equation here, that if you need to, you can go back up to the top, have a new hypothesis, new experiments, new observations based on that information. Many hypotheses have been revised over time, experiments redone before you get a final hypothesis and a final accepted hypothesis. Sometimes you'll never actually get a supported hypothesis, and so what you'll do is you've eliminated all other solutions and say that is the best explanation that we have at this time. It's not always possible to test things. So for example, we'll try to do experiments. We may not be able to go out in the wild and observe animals in their natural habitat, so we might go to a zoo or into a controlled environment. And then using the data that we get there, we're going to devise a results from that. So we may not be able to actually directly test. Historically, evolution, we have this happen a lot. We can't go back in time and see how humans evolved. So we can look at different parts and break it down in order to see exactly. So sometimes experiments aren't possible. We might have to do it in a different context to really see how species evolved. You can kind of read through these. These are all also reasons why we may not be able to experiment. Obviously, a lot of ethical reasons might pertain here, so you can kind of write these down as well. Once again, it's in humans. Humans are the worst things to study. A lot of variables. They lie to you. They don't tell you the truth. Their minds can kind of play a role. So once again, not always the species that we like to use. The last thing that we're going to talk about when we talk about our research or doing anything is that you get it peer reviewed. A peer is obviously someone that's similar to you. So if you are a ichthyologist, you're going to have other ichthyologists reviewing your material to make sure that it is accurate, that all the variables were taken care of, and that the results are actually what you say they are. So that's important to think about. When we talk about how things are published, there's a couple ways you can publish it. You can publish it in the news. The news is not peer reviewed, so it doesn't mean it's true, okay? You could publish it in a scientific magazine. Scientific magazines are better than the news, but they're not peer reviewed either. So those can be proven wrong. The last thing, and this is where you want, is a journal. A scientific journal is always peer reviewed, and so rarely do evidence in a peer reviewed journal ever get overturned. So when you're reading something, if it came from a lot of times these magazines are based or summarized versions of a journal, and that's okay. So for example, beginning of the year when you had to read current events, it was based on journal articles. Peer reviewed, you can kind of see your book talked about this. It allows us to evaluate. You can write this down if you want. Peer reviewed is important because it makes sure that, if it's a non-scientist, the scientists who read the peer reviews know that the person's telling the truth. All right. So go ahead and, like I said, this came directly from your books. If you have any questions, kind of read through that, jot anything down that sticks out. I'm going to try to wrap this video up. And then that's how you share your results. So through this, you've written down a bunch of things. I kind of told you to pause and write that down. I want you to bring that to class. Make sure your name's on it. Bring it to class for A-day periods. You're going to bring it to class on Tuesday. B-day, you're going to bring it on Wednesday, and I'll put that in the instructions as well. That's all I got, guys. Next time, we're going to do a real fun lab with termites, so bring your thinking caps. Have a great day.